Comic Boom.
Hey guys, Comic Boom here to talk about Brian Michael Bendis leaving Superman. It is not official, although it has come out of Bendis' mouth. He is in fact leaving Superman. His run on Superman is ending. Bendis stated in an interview with off-panel podcast by David Harper that he is in fact leaving Superman. His exact words were, "I'm heading toward the end of my run on Superman, so I've been reflective on it, and I will never be more grateful than I got to heal my near-death experience through Superman and then get through this pandemic." That is what Brian Michael Bendis said. His run on Superman is ending. We don't know a lot of details about the circumstances when it's going to be announced officially. I can tell you that his interview with David Harper of the Off-Panel podcast was something that was pulled by David Harper himself. I posted the exact quotes on Twitter. For whatever reason, the interview was released, and then he pulled the interview. I suspect he pulled the interview at the request of DC Comics, but the reality is that it's leaked, so it's fair game. Guys, as far as I'm concerned, you can call it unofficial, official, but unless things drastically changed, or unless Brian Michael Bendis was lying in the interview, he said quite clearly that my run on Superman is ending. Incidentally, guys, I did get a response from the person who was interviewing Brian Michael Bendis, and David Harper, he contacted me on Twitter. He actually tweeted it. It's on my Twitter feed at Metropolis40. He says, "For your information, this interview is down now. It wasn't supposed to run until ... later. But I screwed up the reschedule. Glad you enjoyed it, but it's coming out later for everyone else." Well, guess what? I just revealed it now. Now, when is he going to actually leave? And why hasn't DC released this information? Obviously, DC must be keeping this fairly close to the chest. And I would think that they just announced that they're leaving Diamond, and they've dropped Diamond distribution. So they've gotten some negative PR from that. Despite the fact that many retailers have been bitching about Diamond for years, there seems to be a lot of negative PR that DC has been getting because of their leaving Diamond distributions and going with different distributors. And maybe they're probably waiting for the correct sort of timing to mention that Bendis is leaving Superman. You got to remember that when Bendis coming to DC, that was really hyped. When Bendis states very clearly in the interview, he stated this before, but he reiterates in his interview with David Harper that when he came to Superman and he met with Dan Didio, when he came to DC and he met with Dan Didio assumed that he would want to do Batman, but he assumed wrong. Bendis wanted to do Superman, and they gave him basically carte blanche to do whatever he wanted with Superman. Bendis spent essentially that first year developing the Man of Steel miniseries, that 6-issue miniseries. That led into the Rogol-Zaar arc, and that Rogol-Zaar arc ended with Unity Day, which essentially had John Kent, after being aged up from a 10-year-old to a 17-year-old boy, essentially inspiring the formation of the United Planets, which ultimately in the future also inspired the Legion of Superheroes. And Unity Day ended, that whole Rogol-Zaar storyline, the whole purpose of which was to lead to the formation and the inspiration leading to the Legion of Superheroes in the 31st century. Now that is something that Bendis has really built upon, and he, of course, one can only assume it was his magnum opus, because he certainly talked a big game about revealing Superman's secret identity, or rather Superman voluntarily revealing his secret identity to the world, inspired by his son. Reevaluating his own life course at the end of Unity Day, Superman decided to reveal his identity to the world in the Truth storyline that's still currently playing out in the pages of Superman. And here we are, in the midst of all this. Bendis now says in an interview that he's leaving Superman. Bendis is always very grateful. He's a very nice person. He speaks highly of other writers. He works for his artists. He does his best to craft stories, often specifically around his artists. He certainly does that with Ryan Sook's work in Legion of Superheroes, gorgeous work. And he certainly tries to do that and accommodate even John Romita Jr.'s art in Action Comics, which is not necessarily the greatest art in the world by many standards, but it is what it is. Bendis has really pushed his narrative forward in Superman. And even having Mark and Draco, followed by Jody Hauser, carry on that story in the pages of Supergirl. Supergirl was canceled. Leviathan, he's explored Leviathan. He had a conversation with Dan Didio, which we all know. Dan Didio told him that there's too many intelligence agencies in the DC universe. So Dan Didio actually gave Bendis the idea to sort of wrap up and maybe get rid of all these intelligence agencies in the DC universe, so narrow it down to 2. So now we have essentially, we're going to have Leviathan being the bad guy, the bad intelligence agency, and the good one being Checkmate. So we're going to have Leviathan v Checkmate. And here we have it now, Bendis. Why would Bendis leave Superman if things were going so well? Doesn't that seem a little short-lived? Well, it's obvious that despite the fact that Bendis is certainly well-intentioned and he's very passionate when he puts his heart into something, particularly coming off the fact that he almost died, he speaks very highly of Greg Rucka while Bendis was on the hospital bed healing from his disease that had infected him. Rucka spoke with him almost every day, stayed by his side. They talked a lot of things, Superman and what have you, and things carried on from there. And this is something that writing Superman is very passionate to Bendis. He did write the Batman universe. He really enjoyed that, and that's really a great story. His Batman universe is actually my favorite Bendis DC work. The Batman universe story, if you can buy it in hardcover, I'd recommend it. It's very well done. But the fact is that Bendis' Superman has not been well received. I didn't like the aging up of John Kent from a 10-year-old or a 17-year-old. I didn't like the Rogolzar storyline. It seems unfinished. A lot of the characterizations and the dialogue remains choppy, remains convoluted. It's even called Bendis speak. I mean, when we've created adjectives to describe how a writer does a bad job writing dialogue, that isn't necessarily the greatest thing. Don't get me wrong, a lot of people love Bendis, but he's a divisive writer. And I've always said in Bendis' defense that, in many ways, being a divisive writer is a sign that you're a popular one and a good one because you have divisive camps. Grant Morrison, too, is another one of those writers who is beloved, but he also has, 2 camps, ones that are Morrison apologists and other ones that are, they're not biggest fans of Morrison. So Bendis is a mixed bag. Bendis is coming. He's at DC. Is Bendis going to be leaving just Superman? I think that's all he said. He said he's just leaving Superman. He also made other allusions. He said, and I'm going to quote again, I'm going to read what it said, that he says, "I'm heading toward the end of my run on Superman. So I've been more reflected on it, and I will never be more grateful than I got to heal my near-death experience through Superman and then get through this pandemic." And he goes on to say, no matter what's going on in the world, I got to spend a few hours a day with Superman. And he also made some allusions to Matt Fraction's run on Jimmy Olsen. He says that things that are happening in Jimmy Olsen are in continuity and will absolutely reflect in Superman books in a profound way. So this is something that's particularly interesting. He's leaving Superman, but he's clearly leaving his mark. Where is Bendis going to go after Superman? I think it's quite clear that DC editorially right now is in a state of flux. With the advent of 5G essentially being canceled, whatever Bendis was going to be writing for the 5G timeline, that probably is, they put a kibosh on that. So what is Bendis actually going to be doing? Bendis did mention in the interview that that throughout the pandemic, that one thing that all the writers at DC have an advantage on, he says that they've all kept working. They've worked at home, they've all kept working, and they've got sort of a head start on things. So they've got a lot of stories in the bag here, so to speak. And so you got to wonder, what are the stories that Bendis has been working on? And if he's nearing his end of the Superman run, what is the end of his Superman run going to reflect? Is at the end of Bendis' Superman run, will the secret identity still be in effect? Will he basically remain like Tony Stark and everybody will know that Superman is Clark Kent? Or is it going to be undone? Now that Didio is gone, Didio is the guy that pulled Bendis into DC. Now that the sort of the king of DC right now, or the one that seems to be has the most influence at DC, is Scott Snyder. How does Scott Snyder feel about the secret identity, about the truth reveal in the pages of Superman? Does Scott Snyder like the fact that everybody knows that Clark Kent is Superman? How is that going to play out? In particular, in the current issue of Superman, Action Comics 1022, Connor Kent is revealed to the Kents in the first story arc of the House of Kent, everybody, some people seem to know who Connor Kent is. They seem to remember him. So Jonathan and Martha Kent seem to remember Connor Kent, but they shouldn't remember him because he's from a different timeline. He's from a pre-Flashpoint timeline. So how can they remember Connor Kent? And there seems to be there seems to be a lot of continuity craziness going on. And even in the pages of Lois Lane issue 10, I got to tell you. So here's Action 1022. In the pages of Lois Lane issue 10, Jessica Midnight has a conversation with the Question, Renee Montoya. And Renee Montoya explains to her what Lois explained as well, and that is that they all have memories of previous incarnations of themselves. So this is interesting. Lois Lane, Renee Montoya, and Jessica Midnight actually have dreams, and they sort of have memories of previous incarnations of themselves in different multiverses. That's interesting. It's sort of like the analogy that Rucka uses in the scripting of Lois Lane issue 10. He has Renee Montoya make the analogy or the metaphor to a butterfly, that if you dream you are a butterfly, are you in fact a butterfly, or are you a butterfly dreaming that you are a human? So Rucka tries to, imbue a little bit of poetry to try to explain this idea of, are we in this, what's real and what isn't. That's a pretty good explanation of the DC universe right now. And, what is real? What's the future? What does the future hold? I mean, all these questions that they have. And in the current issue that's coming out this week of Legion of Superheroes issue 6, the new Earth is formed. It finally gets water. The new Earth is fully formed at the end of Legion of Superheroes number 6. I encourage you all to read it. I did the review at Weird Science DC website. Go to the Weird Science DC website. Check out the Weird Science DC podcast. I did a review of Legion of Superheroes number 6. That'll be up later tonight. Check it out, guys. The future of the DC universe. John Kent is the one true Superman, and there's some relationships that are developing, and some enemies and some new enemies are forming in the Legion of Superheroes. The first arc of the Legion of Superheroes ends, and Bendis, I think, has done a reasonably good job with the Legion of Superheroes. And it's interesting whether or not he's going to continue writing the Legion of Superheroes once his Superman run ends. But I don't really know. But what we do know is that his Superman run is ending. And by that, I interpret that to mean that both his run on Superman in Action are ending. Although the further details of all this will have to be flushed out. To review again, Bendis has stated, I'm heading toward the end of my run on Superman, so I've been more reflective on it, and I will never be more grateful than I got to heal my near-death experience through Superman and get through this pandemic. Very, very interesting. So you guys decide, why is Bendis leaving? Do you think Bendis was encouraged to leave Superman? What did they offer him in return? What is Bendis going to be doing if he's not writing Superman or Action Comics? Now, I know he's got a lot on his plate. He's got his Jinx line, which hasn't really been particularly successful. The Wonder Comics line has been a disaster. Jimmy Olsen's sales are deplorable. Let's face it, what Bendis has brought to DC has not exactly been stellar, resulted in stellar sales. So we'll have to see where this takes us. But guys, tell me what you think of this news about Brian Michael Bendis. Are you glad he's leaving Superman in Action Comics? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And until next time, stay safe, and hit the subscribe button. Follow me on Twitter at Metropolis40, and Comic Boom out.